The gate had not opened for an outbound cart in 11 weeks, and it opened that night because Odalys Kestrel was leaving, and nobody had told the wolves. They told her anyway, in their own way. Before the chain had finished dropping, before the guard on the wall had lowered his lantern to check her papers, the sound started in the kennels below the east tower. Not a howl, not yet, but a low, confused keening that ran wolf to wolf until it reached the ones asleep in the great hall and woke them standing. Odalys heard it from the cart seat and told herself it was the cold. She had told herself a great many things that week. She kept her hands flat on her knees, the way she did when she was frightened, and did not look back at the keep. 11 weeks earlier, when the siege lines first closed around the Ravenscar holding, nobody had asked Odalys Kestrel to do anything. That was the truth of her position, and she had built a life out of it. The winter enclosure was not built for comfort even in peacetime. Narrow corridors that trapped the cold rather than the warmth. High windows that let in grey light and little else. A castle that had always felt to her like something that had forgotten how to be warm long before the siege lines arrived to make the forgetting official. Frost gathered on the inside of the kitchen windows most mornings. She had learned, over 6 winters, exactly which hearths held their heat longest, and which corridors to avoid before the fires were lit. Small knowledge no one else bothered to gather, because no one else needed it the way she did. She had come to the winter enclosure 6 years before, as an assistant to a cook who had since died, and she had simply continued being useful in the particular way that made people stop noticing you were there at all. When food stores dropped to 1/3 of what the garrison needed, and the steward began drafting lists of who would eat, and who would be told there was nothing left, Odalys did not wait for a decision. She recalculated the grain, rationed the salted meat against the number of mouths and the number of days the physicians guessed the siege might hold, and fed every soul inside the walls, kitchen staff, garrison, pack wolves in their shifted and unshifted forms alike, without asking permission from anyone above her, because there was no one above her who had time to give it. She did this quietly enough that for the first month, Bastian Ravenscar did not know her name. He knew, in the disconnected way a man knows a fact about his own household without having examined it, that the kitchens were still producing food, and that no one had come to him to report a crisis. He assumed, when he thought of it at all, that this was simply how things worked, that a keep under siege continued to be fed the way a keep under siege continued to have its floors swept, invisibly, by hands he did not need to think about. He had larger problems. The lines outside had not moved in 3 weeks. His scouts reported the besieging force was well supplied and in no hurry, which meant someone inside the alliance that governed his borders had told them exactly how thin his stores would run and exactly when to arrive to watch him starve out. The first time his wolf noticed her, he did not. It happened in the 3rd week, in the lower corridor outside the kitchens, where he had gone to find the steward, and instead found himself standing outside a doorway he had no reason to be near, listening to a woman he did not recognize give quiet, competent instructions to 2 exhausted kitchen boys about how to stretch a broth another day. He did not go in. He told himself afterward that he had been looking for the steward's office, which was 2 corridors further on, in the opposite direction. His wolf, underneath the surface of him, where it had lived silent and dissociated from his waking mind for as long as he could remember, had simply stopped walking and made him stand there for 4 minutes before it let him continue. He did not examine the 4 minutes. He had learned over the years not to ask his wolf what it wanted, because it rarely told him, and because the last time it had wanted something with this kind of unexplained certainty had been never, not once in his memory or in the memory of anyone who had served 3 kings before him. The Ravenscar wolf did not want. It executed. It had not paused mid-stride for anything in living record. Odalys, for her part, noticed him exactly once that week, through the high kitchen window, crossing the inner yard at a pace that told her he had not slept, and thought nothing more of it than she thought of the weather. He was not a man who occupied her attention. He was a fact of the keep, like the siege, like the cold, like the diminishing sacks of grain she counted twice a day. The pack began to shift toward her before he did. It started with the lowest-ranked wolves, the young ones, the injured ones, recovering in the yard behind the kitchens, where she brought them the broth first, because they could not walk to the hall. A yearling with a crossbow wound in his shoulder began sleeping near the kitchen door instead of in the kennels. Then 2 more. Then, in the 5th week, an old grey wolf who had served 3 alpha kings and answered to nothing but rank was found lying across the kitchen threshold at dawn, and would not move until Odalys stepped over him with the morning's water, and said, without particular ceremony, that he was in her way. He moved. He had not moved for anyone below the Alpha King's direct command in 11 years of service. The kitchen boys told the story for days. It did not reach Bastian until the 6th week, relayed to him in passing by his steward as an oddity rather than a concern. The pack has taken a liking to the new cook, as though it were a matter of taste rather than of law. Bastian filed it away and did not think of it again for 3 more days, until his own wolf, standing at the window of the war room during a council he could not afford to leave, turned his head toward the kitchens with a focus that had nothing to do with anything being discussed in the room. That was when he went to find her. He told himself he was investigating a disruption to pack discipline. He stood in the kitchen doorway, the same doorway his wolf had held him at 4 minutes outside of, weeks before, and watched her work before she noticed him, which she did not for nearly a full minute, because she was counting saltfish into a barrel with the particular focus of someone doing arithmetic that mattered. She was not what he expected, though he could not have said what he had expected instead. Dark hair pinned back with strands escaping it that she had clearly stopped trying to control. A face built for composure, the kind that gives itself away only around the mouth. When she finally saw him standing in the doorway, she did not startle, did not curtsy, did not do any of the things 6 years of court training would have taught a woman of higher station to do. She looked at him the way she looked at the saltfish, assessing, brief, returning to the task. "My lord," she said, and went back to counting. He found this unaccountably difficult to walk away from. There was nothing in her manner that invited attention, no performance of humility, no flicker of nervousness at being addressed by the man whose word governed every life inside these walls. And it was precisely that absence of performance that held him in the doorway longer than any council report waiting on his desk. He was used to being managed. Every conversation he had conducted in the 11 weeks since the siege lines closed had been shaped, in some fashion, around what the other party needed from him: reassurance, resources, permission, blame deflected elsewhere. She had asked him for nothing. She had simply kept counting. He did not walk away. He asked her, and this was the part he would turn over later and not entirely understand about himself, how long the stores would hold at the current rationing. Not a command. A question, put to a kitchen worker, whose rank did not require him to ask her anything at all, and he waited for the answer the way he waited for reports from his captains. 19 days at current rationing, she said. 26 if the garrison eats 1 meal instead of 2, which I have not yet told them, because morale matters as much as grain, and I did not think that decision was mine to make alone. "It is yours to make alone," he said. "You have been making it alone for 6 weeks." She looked at him properly then, for the first time, and something in her face reorganized itself slightly. Not fear, not deference, something closer to recalculation. "Then 26 days, she said. "I will speak to the garrison captain this evening." "How long have you run these kitchens?" 6 years, my lord." "I did not know that." "Most people don't," she said, and there was nothing bitter in it, only fact. and he found that harder to hear than bitterness would have been. There was nothing left to say after that, so he left, the way a man leaves a room when he has run out of reasons to occupy it and has not yet found a new one. He came back the next morning to ask about the salt reserves, though the salt reserves had not changed since the previous evening, and he knew it before he asked. The pack noticed before the antagonist did, but not by much. Elsbeth Renmark held the title of First Counsel to House Ravenscar, a position she had occupied under Bastian's father, and had spent the years since consolidating into something closer to a second throne. She managed the treaty relationships that kept 3 border holdings from turning on each other. She managed the alliance that had, apparently, also managed to tell an enemy force exactly when Ravenscar's granaries would run thin, though no one yet knew that particular fact belonged to her. And she managed with the same quiet efficiency Odalys brought to a kitchen the perception that Bastian Ravenscar could not function without her. She noticed the kitchen worker in the 7th week, when a report crossed her desk that pack deference had shifted toward a member of staff with no rank, no bloodline, and no business receiving it. She went to observe for herself and found Bastian Ravenscar standing in a doorway that led nowhere important, watching a woman ladle broth with an expression Elsbeth had not seen on his face in the 11 years she had served his house. She recalculated her threat assessment on the spot. What followed was not cruelty, not at first. It was the particular administrative violence of a woman who had spent a career learning that the fastest way to remove an inconvenient person was to make their continued presence someone else's problem. Odalys found her kitchen budget cut without explanation, found 2 of her staff reassigned to the laundry with no replacement offered, found twice that supply requisitions she had submitted through the proper channel simply never arrived at the quartermaster's desk at all. Bastian found out about the roster changes by accident, reviewing requisitions he had no reason to review, except that his wolf had, again, refused to let him leave his desk until he had gone through the kitchen ledgers line by line. He had the cuts reversed within the hour, quietly, through a clerk, rather than through Elsbeth directly, so that the correction would not read as a confrontation. He told the clerk it was an administrative oversight. The clerk did not ask why the Alpha King had personally reviewed a kitchen ledger during a siege. Odalys found her budget restored the following morning, and never learned who had restored it, though she noticed, without letting herself examine the noticing, that it had happened the day after he had stood in her doorway again. She saw him, properly, for the first time in the 9th week, through the gap in the council chamber doors, left open by a servant who had not latched them. The lords who managed the siege response had gone. He sat alone at the long table with a single dispatch in his hand, and he had not turned the page once in the 2 hours she had been passing by that corridor on her rounds. His shoulders held the particular stillness of a man conserving the last of something. She did not go in. She stood for a moment longer than she meant to, understanding for the first time that the man managing everyone inside these walls was also managing the cost of managing everyone, and that no one, not the pack, not the lords, not even his own wolf, was managing him. She carried that alone into the kitchen, and did not mention it to anyone. The first deliberate touch happened 3 days later, in the corridor outside the great hall, when he had been about to walk past her on his way to a council he was already late for, and instead stopped and straightened the collar of her cloak, which had folded wrong against her neck. 1 motion, 2 seconds, no comment, and continued down the corridor without looking back. She stood still a moment before she remembered where she had been going. Neither of them spoke of it. Both of them thought of it more than either would have admitted. The archivist, an old pack historian named Hendrik, who had outlived 2 Alpha Kings and forgotten more about Ravenscar law than most lords ever learned, was the one who finally said the number aloud. He had been summoned, at Bastian's quiet request, to explain why a wolf that had never once broken formation in living memory had lain down across a kitchen threshold for a servant with no rank. Hendrik was an old man who did not enjoy being rushed, and he took his time laying 3 ledgers across the war room table before he answered. "It has not happened since the last true Alpha Queen," he said. "The bond that runs beneath the wolf's obedience, the one that tells a pack who its queen is before the king himself knows, has been silent, suppressed, if my grandfather's notes are correct, by decree of your ancestor, the second Ravenscar king, who found the bond inconvenient to a marriage he required for political reasons, and had his court sorcerer bind it into dormancy rather than let it choose for him. The decree was never lifted. It simply outlived everyone who remembered signing it." He tapped the oldest ledger. 261 years, my lord. That is how long the bond has slept, and it is not asleep any more." Bastien said nothing for a long moment. "You are certain of the number?" "I have checked it 3 times since the pack started sleeping at her door," Hendrik said. 261 years is not a figure I would state to my Alpha King carelessly. The knowledge sat in Bastien differently than he expected. Not triumph, not even relief. Something closer to dread, because a bond 261 years suppressed did not care whether its timing was convenient, and his timing had never been worse. A siege at his gates, an ally he could no longer fully trust, and a woman who had built 6 years of safety around never being noticed by anyone who might discard her the moment it became complicated. Odalys carried her own version of the number differently. She had not asked for it. She had built her invisibility the way other people built fortune, deliberately, over years, because visibility in a court like this one had cost women she'd known everything they had. A suppressed bond breaking toward her did not feel like a gift. It felt like a spotlight aimed at the one thing she had spent 6 years avoiding. The siege tightened in the 11th week. Scouts reported movement along the eastern tree line at dusk, siege ladders visible for the first time in the low light, and the bell that signaled a breach attempt rang before the household had finished its evening meal. The garrison scrambled to the walls. Everyone else, kitchen staff, laundresses, the handful of children the war had orphaned into the keep's care, was herded down toward the lower corridors near the storerooms, the closest thing the winter enclosure had to shelter that could not be reached from the outer wall. Odalys had been mid-count when the bell rang, and she did not stop counting so much as continue it while moving, herding 2 of the youngest kitchen boys ahead of her with one hand at each of their collars. The corridor filled fast, too fast, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, in a space built for a fraction of the household. And somewhere in the crush, a torch bracket came loose from the wall and clattered to the stone floor, and the crowd surged away from the sound in a single frightened motion that nearly took her feet out from under her. Bastien found himself between her and the collapsing press of the crowd before either of them had decided anything. His arm came around her, solid and certain, pulling her back against him until the worst of the surge passed and the corridor settled into something closer to order. He did not look down at her. She did not look up. Neither of them spoke, while the shouting overhead continued, the garrison captain's voice carrying down through the stone, then quieter, then the specific, particular silence that meant the ladders had been repelled rather than climbed. When the corridor cleared, he released her without comment, and she told herself, unconvincingly, that the unsteadiness left in her chest belonged to the crowd, and not to the 2 seconds his hand had rested at her waist before he let go. Elsbeth used the breach as her opening. She went to Bastien directly, framing her concern as loyalty rather than ambition. The kitchen workers' sudden influence over the pack was destabilizing command structure during active siege, she said. And destabilized command structure during active siege got soldiers killed. She recommended reassignment. Somewhere distant, a border holding 2 provinces away, where the pack's attention could not follow. Bastien refused, but the refusal cost him something Elsbeth understood better than he did. It told her definitively what she needed to know about how far the bond had already gone, and it told her that removing Odalys quietly was no longer an option. It would have to be public, and it would have to look like Odalys's own failure, rather than Elsbeth's engineering. The almost came 2 nights later. He had gone to the kitchens after the household slept, ostensibly to review the following day's rationing, and found her still awake, still counting, in the low light of a single lamp. He had been about to say something. He did not know what, only that it had been building in him for weeks and had finally reached the surface, when his second knocked and entered without waiting, carrying an urgent dispatch about troop movement on the Western Line. By the time the door closed again, neither of them remembered how to return to the sentence he had not finished. The confrontation came on the 14th day, when Elsbeth produced, before the full council, evidence that Odalys Kestrel had been diverting kitchen supplies for personal use, a fabricated ledger, cross-referenced with genuinely missing stores that Elsbeth herself had quietly redirected weeks earlier to manufacture the shortfall. The accusation, delivered with careful sorrow rather than open attack, was designed to force Bastien into a choice between the law and the woman his pack had chosen, exile the thief, or be seen protecting her out of a bond he had not yet confirmed to anyone outside the room. Odalys did not wait to be defended. She stood before the full council and laid her own true ledgers on the table beside Elsbeth's fabricated one. 6 years of records, meticulous, dated, cross-checked against the quartermaster's independent tallies, which showed not a diversion, but a rationing plan that had fed the entire keep through 11 weeks of siege on stores that should have run out in 7. "My Lord Counsel says I diverted 3 barrels of salted meat in the 9th week," she said, her voice steady in a room built to make steadiness difficult. "I would ask her to name the date. I have every requisition I filed cross-referenced against the quartermaster's own tallies, which he keeps independently of my kitchen, and which she has not had the opportunity to alter." She turned the ledger to face the table rather than herself, a gesture Bastien noticed and did not forget. "I would also ask her to explain 3 requisitions I submitted in the 7th week that never reached the quartermaster's desk at all, time-stamped within a day of her own signature on the transfer order that rerouted them to the eastern storeroom rather than the kitchens." The room went very quiet. Elsbeth's composure held for another moment, long enough to suggest, with practiced sorrow, that a servant under suspicion might easily fabricate records to protect herself. Before the garrison captain, unprompted and visibly uncomfortable at finding himself the deciding voice in a council dispute above his station, confirmed that the missing requisitions had indeed crossed his own desk, bearing the First Counsel seal on the rerouting order. He had assumed at the time that it was an authorized reallocation. He had not thought to question it, because no one questioned Elsbeth Renmark. The room understood, within a minute of Odalys speaking, that the woman under accusation had been the reason the keep was still fed, and the woman making the accusation had been the reason it had nearly starved. Bastien did not need to defend her. She had defended herself with the same quiet competence that had fed his household for 11 weeks, and it was, he thought, watching her, the single most devastating thing he had ever seen done at that table. Elsbeth's composure did not survive the moment the garrison captain, unprompted, confirmed the missing requisitions had crossed his desk with her seal on the rerouting order. She was removed from council that night, her decades of consolidated influence undone in the space of 1 meeting by a woman she had spent 2 months trying to erase. It took the household clerks 3 more days to trace the full extent of what she had done, a decade of quiet arrangements with border merchants, treaty terms rewritten by a single clause here and there, until the alliance she had sworn to manage had become an alliance that answered to her rather than to the throne she served. The besieging force had not arrived by accident, and it had not withdrawn out of mercy. It had withdrawn because the leverage Elsbeth had promised them, a starved keep, a king too distracted by scandal to hold his own borders, had evaporated the moment her ledgers were exposed on the council table. Hendrik, when asked to comb the old records for precedent, found none. No First Counsel in Ravenscar history had ever been removed for treason of this scale, which meant no one could tell Bastian with any certainty how deep the rot had gone, only that it had gone further than a single season of siege could explain. It should have ended there, in triumph. It did not, because Odalys had understood something in that room that no one else had. That the bond breaking toward her would never stop being a political weapon for someone, that there would always be another Elsbeth, that a servant with no bloodline and no protection beyond a king's unconfirmed attachment would spend the rest of her life as a target for exactly this. She had built 6 years of safety on being unseen. The council chamber had just made that impossible, permanently, whether the bond confirmed or not. She left that night. She told no one but the gatehouse guard, who let her through because the siege had lifted with Elsbeth's collaboration exposed and the enemy force withdrawing at dawn, and because nobody had told him a kitchen worker leaving was anything the Alpha King needed to be woken for. The wolves told him anyway. Bastian woke to the sound of the pack in the yard below his window, a keening that had not been heard in the keep in 261 years, and understood, before anyone came to inform him of anything, exactly what it meant. The bond, suppressed since before his grandfather's grandfather sat this throne, did not break quietly. It broke the way a held breath breaks, all at once, with no patience left for a man who had spent 2 months learning to want something and had still not said so. He reached the gate on foot, wolf fast, faster than the horse his second was still saddling behind him, and found the cart barely a quarter-mile down the frozen road, moving slowly enough in the dark that he closed the distance before she had heard him coming. She stopped the cart when she saw him. She did not look surprised. She looked like a woman who had expected, on some level, that this was exactly how the night would go, though she had told the gatehouse guard otherwise, and had told herself otherwise more firmly still, the whole quiet length of the road behind her. The cold had settled into her hands despite the cloak, and she had been rehearsing uselessly what she would say if anyone came after her at all. Some version of gratitude, some version of goodbye. Nothing that admitted how much of the leaving had cost her. None of it survived the sight of him standing in the road in his shirt-sleeves, no coat, having clearly not stopped for one on his way out the gate. "You didn't have to come after me," she said. "I didn't decide to," he said. "The wolf did. It's been deciding things for weeks, and not telling me until after." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "The answer is that I have spent 2 months finding reasons to stand in doorways I have no business standing in, and I ran out of reasons 3 weeks ago, and I kept coming anyway." He stopped a foot from the cart, close enough that his breath showed white between them in the cold. "You were the reason the keep was fed for 11 weeks. You were the reason I found out what Elsbeth had been doing to my house for a decade. You were the reason the pack remembered what it is supposed to feel like to have someone worth following. None of that required a bond. I would have come after this cart if the wolf had never made a sound." She did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter. "I have spent 6 years making sure no one needed me to matter. It was safer that way." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to stop being careful. I'm asking you to be careful somewhere that isn't a cart on a frozen road at midnight." He put his forehead against hers then, and she felt him exhale. Slow, deliberate, like a man setting something heavy down after carrying it a long way. Neither of them spoke. She put her hand flat against his chest and felt his heartbeat steady under her palm. And for the length of that silence, it was enough, more than enough, to answer the question neither of them had asked aloud. "Why did you come to the kitchen doorway that first week?" she said finally, "before you even knew my name?" "I didn't know," he said. "My wolf knew. It stood there for 4 minutes and would not let me leave, and I told myself I was looking for the steward. That's a very long 4 minutes to explain away. I had 261 years of practice, not asking my wolf what it wanted," he said. "I am learning to ask now." She kissed him then, brief, certain, her cold hands at his jaw and his arms already around her before either of them had finished deciding to. And it settled something in the frozen air between them that no council chamber, no ledger, no ancient decree had managed to settle in 2 months of careful distance. He walked the cart horse back to the keep himself, her seated beside him, and did not let go of her hand for the length of the road. The kitchens looked different at dawn 3 weeks later, though nothing in them had changed except the fact that the door stood open and the Alpha King was leaning in the frame of it, unbothered by the flower on his sleeve, where he had, against all sense, insisted on helping carry sacks that morning. The old grey wolf slept across the threshold, as he had for weeks now, and stepped over him the way she always did, without ceremony, because he was still in her way. The pack ate well that morning, and every morning after, not because a siege demanded it, but because it was simply how the kitchen ran now, the way it had run for 6 years, before anyone above her had thought to notice. Ilsbeth's replacement on the council was a quieter man, with no ambitions beyond doing his work honestly, which suited everyone. The bond that had slept 261 years had become, within a season, an unremarkable fact of the household, mentioned in passing, taken for granted, the way people eventually take for granted anything that has finally been given time to become ordinary. Odalys still counted the saltfish herself every morning, out of habit rather than necessity, and Bastian still found reasons to stand in the doorway while she did it, though now he no longer pretended the reasons were anything but the truth. "You never did answer," she said one morning, not looking up from the barrel. "Why you had the roster changed? 6 years no one asked, and then suddenly the quartermaster couldn't do enough for the kitchens. I didn't like the idea of my kitchens running on cut supplies during a siege," he said. "That was 2 months before the bond confirmed anything. You didn't know what I was to you yet." "I knew what you were to the keep," he said. "The rest caught up eventually." She smiled at that, the small, private smile she had learned over the season, to stop hiding from him, and went back to her counting, and he stayed in the doorway, unbothered, exactly where he had no reason to be and every reason to stand. The old grey wolf had taken to following her on her morning rounds through the storerooms, a habit none of the pack's own historians could explain except by pointing, again, to the ledgers Hendrik kept updating with careful, delighted handwriting. A bond 261 years dormant did not simply switch itself back off once it had been allowed to wake, and it had apparently decided the safest place for itself was underfoot in whatever room Odalys occupied. The kitchen staff had stopped remarking on it by midwinter. Visitors to the keep still did, occasionally, pausing in the doorway to watch an Alpha King's wolf sleep across a threshold for a woman counting saltfish, and the household had learned to let them stare and say nothing, because there was nothing left to explain that the sight did not already make plain. Bastian never did learn to stop finding reasons to be near the kitchens, though by spring he had stopped pretending they were reasons at all. He read dispatches at the long table nearest the ovens more often than he read them in the council chamber. He argued, more than once, and always without success, that this was more efficient. Odalys never once believed him, and never once asked him to stop. If something in your own life had gone silent for 261 years, a bond, a hope, a thing you had stopped expecting to happen, would you have recognized it the night it finally broke, or would you have needed someone to say the number out loud first? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time.